you're not prepared for a media interview, you can be very knowledgeable, and I'm sure you would all agree that Jeff knows what he's talking about. But it's really important to remember that just because you know a lot about a topic does not mean when the media interview comes that you are going to be able to get out exactly what you want. In fact, you can be an absolute expert in a topic, and then at the end of the interview, you can say, what just happened? I didn't get to talk about what I wanted to. Or you may often hear this said by people, hang on, I talked to that reporter for 15 minutes, and then that was the quote they took from me. Right? So basically, that's what we're here today to give you a bit of an idea about how to tackle this particular challenge.
Hi friends, welcome to the Professional Development Forum or PDF. It's really good to have you here with us tonight. My name is Washington and I'll be the moderator for this evening. Those of you unfamiliar with the PDF, PDF was established to help diverse professionals reach their full potential in their careers. We are a group of volunteers eager to help others by giving them access to the knowledge, mindset, and network to become the best version of themselves. Just before I go ahead, just a bit of housekeeping. Please note this is a recorded session that will be distributed via social media, YouTube or LinkedIn later on. Also, I would like everyone to update the names and turn on the cameras, please, so we can better connect with each other. Lastly, if you have any question, please put them in the chat box on there. And if you can do like Q1, Q2, Q3, we know which one's questions and follow through the order, you'll be really lovely. And you have the opportunity to ask this question directly towards the end of the session. Well, I'll be moderate a bit that, but you can ask yourself directly to Ky at the end. So yeah, let's get to the meat. So at one point or another in your career, you may have to from the media. It just somehow happens. But how many of us are properly trained to communicate and get the desired message across with authenticity? So tonight we have a special guest, Ky Chow. He'll be sharing his simple ideas and techniques for effective media performance. Ky has over 10 years media experience at outlets such as ABC, Fairfax and Sky News as both interview journalist and interviewed guest commentator. He has powerful and up-to-date expertise in how to make your media appearances effective. So without further ado, I hand over to Ky. All yours, mate.
Great, thanks, Washington. Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for giving up what seems to be dinner time to join this webinar. You look at just echoing what Washington said. Definitely encourage you all to turn your video on so we can see each other, make it a bit more personal and a little bit less remote. I think we all needed just that little bit of extra human contact during these COVID times. So look, it's great to see so many people showing up to the seminar. Now, I just want to confirm, like I will be presenting from slides tonight, but if you do want to see my somewhat maybe not so handsome face, I think you can see that at the same time. But just make sure that you can see the slides because I will be working off those. As Washington mentioned, if you've got any questions at all, then Washington, refresh my memory again how people are going to ask their questions because I don't want them to hesitate.
Sure. Yeah, if you can, like, write Q1, Q2. So we follow the order and then just like put on the chat box, please.
Yeah. So there's a group chat then
yes,
that they can chuck it on.
Yes, please. Yeah. So like, towards the end, we can go and then like, one by one, and then they can ask directly or I can moderate their questions.
Okay. I'll make sure that I leave time for some Q&A at the end. But I'm also happy to be contacted afterwards as well, if anyone has any follow-up questions they weren't able to ask. Anyway, without further ado, thank you, Washington, for the introduction. Just a little bit more about me. Who's Ky Chow, you might be asking? So as mentioned, I've worked for more than 10 years in journalism, as well as media consulting, which is what I'm doing right now. You can see some of the places I've worked for there. So it's mainly been, I've done a bit of writing work, but most of my work has actually been television journalism and television reporting. I also do some regular appearances as a commentator on the ABC and also Sky News. So my media training is based not just on being the journalist who knows how to ask you, being an interview subject who knows how to receive the curly questions as well. So hopefully I've got that empathy in what I say. Whoops, looks like I've been muted. And now I've been unmuted. Excellent. Okay, anyway, I'm not sure how much you heard of that, but don't worry, it wasn't that important. Let's get on with a bit more of the meat. And for this, I've actually selected a volunteer. There's no time like the present. Before I go to talking about media training and going through the principles, we're going to have a look at what a media interview might look like if you've never been media trained before. And for that, I am going to be calling on Jeffrey Wang, who's the founder of Sydney Professional Development Forum. He has agreed to a scenario where he has been contacted by my network. So let's just pick my most recent high profile employer. I worked for the ABC as a radio reporter. And so basically Jeff is here to talk about, in my point of view, from the reporter's point of view, I've called Jeff in because I want to interview him about Asian leadership, right? However, that isn't necessarily what Jeff wants to talk about. So what you're going to witness now is an interview between Jeff and I, which has been completely unprepared. Jeff has never been media trained before because we want this to be as realistic as possible. In other words, there are many people who are thrown into media interviews, and that could be you one day. And so we're just going to demonstrate how that might go. Jeff, are you ready? So so let's say the cameras are rolling. Jeff is going to be doing this Zoom interview from home. He's going to be interviewed by someone at the ABC. So a fairly common scenario. They're doing a lot of Zoom interviews at the moment rather than bringing people into studio. Okay, so Asian leadership has been on the agenda once again in the news. We're seeing new research from the Diversity Council of Australia showing that there's a disproportionately low number of people of Asian background working in leadership positions. To talk about this more, I'm joined by Jeffrey Wang, who is a young he's a young Asian leader. We would say he's been very active in the corporate world, in particular at Telstra. He runs a not-for-profit called Professional Development Forum. Thank you for joining us today, Jeff.
Thank you, Ky. It's good to join you.
Okay, so Jeff, I just want to get started. Why do you think there are so few people from an Asian background in leadership positions?
That's a very big question, Ky. There's quite a number of reasons. Look, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's just not enough there's not enough Asian leaders in the pipeline, and as a result, there's not a whole lot of Asian leaders in management right now.
Right, okay. I mean, you mentioned that it's about the pipeline, but how much do you think that inbuilt discrimination exists within Australian workplaces that might be keeping people from an ethnically diverse or culturally diverse background out of leadership and senior positions?
Look, the research shows that when resumes are sent out with everything being the same, in fact, there was a study that was conducted by the ANU, when they sent out 4,000 resumes, everything being the same other than the name, suggesting that whether this person may be from an Asian background versus someone who's maybe from a non-Asian background, the study shows that the person with the Asian background has to send out 1.7 times more resumes just to get the same number of interviews. So it'd be very difficult to argue that there is nothing inbuilt into that system.
Right, so you're basically saying that racism is a fairly substantial component then?
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that, but it certainly reflects in the outcome of the candidates in their effort to apply for an interview, so applying for a role.
So what can be done about this? For example, the Diversity Council has advocated for targets or even quotas to achieve a more diverse workforce. What's your view on that?
Look, I'm personally not for quotas. However, I do understand why people feel that quotas would be an effective solution. I do believe that the solution lies in the grassroots. Asian talents themselves have to become more adept at leadership and more adept at cross-cultural leadership, right? So a lot of that means that they have to take the actions upon themselves to prepare themselves for leadership in the Australian context.
And you don't think then that it's more a result of, it sounds like you're putting a lot of responsibility on the Asian community here, Jeffrey. I mean, you wouldn't agree, for example, with the former Race Discrimination Commissioner, Tim Sopomasan, who says that this kind of self-help mentality actually isn't what we need. The burden needs to be placed on companies and management to hire more diversely.
Well, look, unfortunately, this is a complex issue that's just not going to have a black and white answer. The reality is that we've got to meet each other halfway. And as you know, that 80% of what happens to you is within your control. What I'm calling for is for these Asian leaders to take charge of what they're responsible for, and then the rest of it should follow.
Okay. Jeffrey Wang, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Kai.
Okay. So that brings an end to our little interview to begin with. Now, first of all, Jeff, it's your first time being mock interviewed like that. First of all, what were your impressions about how that interview went?
Oh, that was pretty difficult actually, because first of all, I had no idea that what question you're going to ask. I knew you were going to be a little bit controversial and jump into it, but even then I could not think fast enough to get myself out of the trouble spots. And I think I just had trouble collecting thoughts in time to have a considered answer.
Yeah, and can I ask, was there something in particular that you had wanted to say heading into the interview?
Look, you know this particular issue I'm very passionate about. What I wanted to say was that it was a very nuanced response, but it's very difficult to come up with one where you're not prepared.
Sure. So certainly there's that issue of a lack of preparation. One of the things we had suggested, though, was that you might want to give a mention to Professional Development Forum, correct?
Yeah, that probably would have been helpful. Yeah.
Right. So anyway, what my point is to show everyone here is that if you're not prepared for a media interview, you can be very knowledgeable. And I'm sure you would all agree that Jeff knows what he's talking about. But it's really important to remember that just because you know a lot about a topic does not mean when the media interview comes that you are going to be able to get out exactly what you want. In fact, you can be an absolute expert in a topic, and then at the end of the interview, you can say, what just happened? I didn't get to talk about what I wanted to. Or you may often hear this said by people, hang on, I talked to that reporter for 15 minutes, and then that was the quote they took from me. Right? So basically, that's what we're here today to give you a bit of an idea about how to tackle this particular challenge. So let's get things off. The first important question you need to think about is why you are doing the media interview. You need to be very, very clear as to why you are there. Quite simply, you have something important you want people to know. Seems fairly straightforward, right? I've got something important, I want to share it with people. But believe it or not, that is not often why people go into media interviews. They often do so because they think that they are being brought in to talk about a topic and they should jump on the opportunity to raise their profile, for example. Or they think they're in there to answer questions about a particular topic. Well, let me show you. This quote from Henry Kissinger, who once opened a media conference. So Henry Kissinger, a former US Secretary of State, he's still alive actually at the age of 97. And he started a media conference by saying, "Does anyone have any questions for my answers?" So straight away, he signaled two things. First of all, he signaled that he was well prepared. No matter what curly questions the journalist had, he was going to be ready for them. Secondly, he also made it clear that he wasn't just there to answer the journalist's questions. Now, this is a concept when it comes to media training that sometimes people feel a bit uncomfortable about. They say, "Oh, look, I don't want to be one of those politician types who never answers questions. They drive me crazy," right? And that's a really good point. But on the other hand, it's also very important for you, if you're going to do media interviews, to be able to take control of the interview and not be led off by the reporter on what they want to talk about, and instead talk about what you want to talk about. So in other words, you are not doing a media interview just to answer questions. And that's a very important mentality to have, that you remember that you are there because you have something important to share with your target audience. Okay? Now, and by that, so what do I mean? How does this work in practicality? So let's say you are brought before a media interview, say in front of this formidable lady, Lee Sales from the ABC, certainly one of Australia's most prominent interviewers, an excellent journalist, and she really knows how to put the screws on a subject and ask some really provocative, thought-provoking questions. However, you need to remember that when you are doing the interview, you are not there to talk to Lee Sales. You are not there to convince Lee Sales or whoever the journalist is. The journalist is just a vehicle for you to talk to your audience, right? So, and that is far more diverse than that reporter that you might be speaking to. So it's important that you think about you understanding your audience. You are not there to talk to the reporter, okay? In other words, you of course are there to answer their questions and to have a conversation with them, but the person that you should have in your mind as you're interviewing them is not the person who's asking the question, but imagine the people who are watching your conversation with the reporter. That is your audience. So, with that in mind, what do your audience know about your topic so far? That's one of the kind of questions that you need to think about when it comes to the audience, okay? Are they experts in what you're talking about? Do they already know? For example, if you're there to talk about COVID-19, for example, and the impact on business, how much does your audience know about it so far? Imagine how much news coverage they would be reading. Now, you might be an expert in COVID-19 because you've been reading in and out non-stop for the last 6 months. Maybe it's a fundamental part of your job. Maybe you're the COVID-19 marshal at the place where you work. But not everyone thinks like that. So always try to put yourself in your audience's shoes in terms of how much they know about a topic. What else? What terms need to be explained or even avoided? So what do I mean by that? If you use a jargon term, right? Like, so perhaps you work in insurance and you talk a lot about, something like, a particular term of your industry. It might be something like, gross margins, for example. And you think, well, hey, I'm talking, let's say your interview is with ABC Business. Hey, I'm talking to a business program. That reporter knows what I'm talking about, right? The difference is, though, is that their audience may not. A term like gross margin, for example, may mean very different things to many different industries and might have a different significance. So if you are going to use some terms in the media, always explain them, right? Always explain them in basic terms. And another one about understanding the audience that I really encourage people to try to do is to build a picture, a visual picture of someone from a certain culture, a certain income group, nationality, or education background. Because once you have that picture in your mind, you are automatically going to be able to adjust how you do the interview to suit your target audience. And remember, again, that target audience might be very different to the reporter sitting in front of you in terms of their cultural background, their income, their nationality, or education. Okay. So how would you talk to this person versus colleagues? So that's one of the fundamental things that we're going to test out today. Now, in case you're wondering, well, I don't know much about the audience. I just got asked by the ABC to be on there and I thought it was a good opportunity, right? So that's fine. But remember, if a journalist invites you on to do a media interview, you can always simply ask them, hey, can you just tell me what kind of people listen to your program? Can you just tell me a bit more about them? Because no matter how much you might think you know about their audience, they'll surprise you. They're bound to say something that you weren't expecting, and that's something that will help you prepare for the interview. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of keeping your audience in mind, and that should hopefully lead you to another very important principle when it comes to doing, to be honest, not just media interviews. If you ever do public speaking or if you ever present at work, the importance of plain English can never be overestimated. Okay, so what do we mean by that? So plain English is being able to use something other than jargon, for example. And as I mentioned before, if you do use jargon, explain it in plain English. And the reason is, even experts and professionals, so I imagine many of you would be experts and professionals, right? They are not experts in everything. Okay, so for example, let's say you are speaking on a business issue and you're speaking to the Financial Review and you think, well, they're all educated business people. And then you start, because you work in, say, funds management or accounting, for example, you might start talking about PE ratios and dividends and so forth. The problem is that a lot of your audience may not be share trading experts. They might be property experts, which is an investment expert, but they might have no clue about your industry because they are specialists. So always remember that just because you have an intelligent audience that you are targeting, they are not, believe it or not, intelligent in everything. Okay? And they also get tired and distracted. So many of the times that people are going to watch your interview, they're going to be watching it on a phone, on a tablet, and they're going to have many other distractions. It could be their 8-year-old kid. It could be, the signs going past the window on the bus. It could be social media, right? They're just kind of flicking in between your interview while they're flicking through Facebook. Okay, so it's important to remember plain English is a way of cutting through a lot of those obstacles, right? The plainer you speak, the easier it's going to be for people to remember what you say. Okay. Okay, so I've given you a bit of an overview about hopefully keeping your target audience in mind. Now I want to talk about what to say. So most of you who were here from the start, you'll remember how Jeff answered a whole lot of my questions, but then at the end he said, well, look, I just didn't really know quite what to say. I wasn't quite prepared. So the question is, what should you prepare when you head into a media interview? Now, many of you might rightly think, well, one of the things I need to prepare in a media interview is a whole lot of potential questions, right? Here are the kind of questions that they might ask me, and I'm going to prepare an answer for every single one of them. That should not be the only thing that you do. In fact, there's something else that I think you should do that's perhaps even more important. And the reason is, as I mentioned before, you're not there just to answer the journalist's questions. You are there because you have something important you want to talk about, and it might be different to what the journalist wants to talk about. Now, is that wrong, right? Like if the journalist has brought you in to, for example, to talk about the lack of Asian leadership, and quite frankly, you're there because you want to give a plug to your organization, say Professional Development Forum, is that wrong? Well, it depends, right? Do you think that the journalist is in touch with what people want to know? Or do you think that what you think is important is maybe more important to the audience than the journalist might appreciate? Okay, so that's something that you need to have in mind. And one of the fundamental things that you need to prepare before going into a media review is what we call key messages. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this concept of key messages. You may have heard it discussed sometimes in somewhat negative terms. Politicians have key messages, right? CEOs have key messages that they stick to during an interview. So they can have a little bit of a bad reputation, but it's not the only, but it should not be only a bad reputation. Key messages and what we call supports for those key messages are fundamental to ensuring a good media experience if they are done right. So let's have a look at what are key messages, okay? They are, in a way, a sort of a headline. 1 to 3 things that you want people to remember. Okay, 1 to 3 things that, and I say 1 to 3 because they need to be few in number, okay, and they need to be short and simple. That's what key messages are, and then you back them up with detailed supports, which we'll discuss shortly as well. But basically, key messages are designed, and they also need to be focused on that target audience that we talked about. So don't come up with key messages that you think are really convincing. Come up with key messages that you think that your audience would find very convincing, okay? So why have key messages? The average person receives 3,000 pieces of information per day, right? And that, you just imagine how many people are on their mobile phones, the amounts of different content they go through. Imagine the different types of, imagine, for example, the types of distractions they see going by their windows. That is a lot of things to cut through. Another reason why you would have key messages is repetition of a key message equals retention. So if you have a small number of key messages and you only say one of them once during a 5-minute interview, what do you think the chances are that your target audience is going to remember that key message? It's small. But if you have a small number of key messages and you're able to say it more than once, say you say it 2 or even 3 times during the interview, I promise you, even if someone happened to be scrolling through Twitter at the first time you said your key message, they won't miss it the second time, and they definitely won't miss it a third time, okay? So now I'm not saying that you need to repeat a key message incessantly throughout the interview to the point of being annoying. You should never do any of these media techniques to the point of being annoying, right? But it's important to remember that if you just have a small number of key messages that you remember going into an interview, you're much more likely to be able to remember them well enough to say them more than once, okay? Also, simplicity equals retention. So I mentioned that key messages need to be short and simple, right? And that's because the shorter and simpler they are, the more likely people are going to remember it. Simple as that. If you have a topic that you think, oh, well, it's just too nuanced, it's too complex, I can't explain it simply, but I would challenge you to try to make it simpler anyway, because it is much better for you to have a simple version of one of the key messages you're getting across rather than a long, complex version of what you're trying to say that absolutely no one is going to remember, right? And again, remember, even if you're talking to an intelligent audience, they are busy, right? And they are going to forget things and be distracted too, okay? So, and it helps both you and your target audience, by the way. I mentioned that it's something that your audience is going to remember. Well, guess what? When the lights go on in the studio, having a small number of key messages is going to help you cope with stage fright. Okay. If you remember a whole lot of complex answers to a long list of questions that you've prepared, I promise you, as soon as the lights go on, about 90% of them are going to fly straight out of your head during the interview. Whereas if you have a small number of simple, short messages, no matter how panicked you get, you can always take a breath and you're going to find those much easier to remember. Okay, so that's why key messages are important. So I just want to check again. I think the preferred format is PDF is to hold the questions to the end, I believe. Normally, I'm quite happy to take questions throughout. I don't know, guys. Are we still wanting to hold any questions to the end?
I suppose if you feel okay doing the middle of the segment, I'll be fine with that.
I'm happy maybe just to take a couple from time to time, because otherwise it's just me talking for way too long a period of time.
So let's say 2 questions. Would be okay with 2 questions?
Yeah, throw us a couple if you've got some.
Cool. First question would be from Robert Dunn. Robert, would you like to ask the question directly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Washington. Hi, Ky. What I'd like to know is whether the same principles you've just described now, whether they apply when you're talking to the print media, and maybe perhaps to elaborate a little bit further around the whole process. When talking to the media, is it generally a collaborative process, or you're just thrown to the wolves, so to speak?
Yeah, no. Look, that's a great question. Well, it's a great set of questions. First of all, is it different for print media? So look, if we have time, I'm going to go through the differences between print and broadcast media. So whether you're doing an interview with the AFR versus the ABC, for example. But look, if we don't have time to get to that, the fundamental principles are still the same. You're right, a print interview often tends to go much, much longer. Right? Can go 30 minutes, an hour sometimes if you're having lunch with a journalist. And so there are differences, but fundamentally it is important still to have key messages going in, right? Because whether you have 1 hour or 1 minute to speak, you still have something important you want to get out to people. So something like key messages is still important. As for your second question about, what was your second question, Robert?
Yeah, whether the interview process is a collaborative one, or whether you just drop into the middle of it and expect to swim in the deep end.
See, it depends on the situation, of course, right? So let's say you work for a company and something bad has happened. Journalists, we love bad news. I know it sounds bad, but people are interested. When people are concerned about something, they're much more likely to pay attention. So as a result, if your company does something naughty, or if you do something bad, and or not even that you do something bad, you do something that other people think is bad and you end up in the media, all right, then that sometimes can mean the media interview is going to be much more challenging, right? The journalist is not there to be your mate, right? You might be there because you want to tell your story, and the journalist is happy to give you your say, but they don't necessarily want to give you a free ride, okay? In fact, there are many journalists who just simply don't ever want to be thought of that way. So here's one example. As a journalist, I can tell you one of the worst things that we receive is when people say, oh, can you tell me what questions you're going to ask in the interview? Never, ever ask a journalist for the questions they're going to ask you, because then they will feel that they're just being a PR advertising mouthpiece for you. Whereas journalists pride themselves on being creative, being able to think of things themselves, of being independent and uncompromised. So in that sense, it's certainly not that collaborative. Now, can you ask them, could you let me know what topics you're going to ask me about just so I can prepare? They're going to be much more receptive. Now, in terms of other more collaborative interviews, say you might be brought in as a commentator, as I am. So that means that I won't necessarily be challenged on a personal level. So they won't say, look, Ky, isn't it true that you did this 5 years ago, for example, right? Like I might be brought in, for example, to give some commentary on journalism today, right? I might be brought in on a topic like, you know, Ky, can you talk about why journalism is struggling financially or something like that, right? So that's slightly more collaborative in the sense that I know I'm not going to be grilled personally, but that nevertheless still, there's still challenges that come even with a more collaborative interview. And then of course, you've got the so-called puff piece interview where your company's done really, really well. You've got a great good news story to sell. And then the journalist is there before you. Now, in a way it is collaborative, but again, the journalist is not there to run an ad for you. And so they often will try to ask you some clear questions, even if it's a good news story. Does that answer the question, Robert?
Yeah, it does. Thanks very much. It's very good information there.
No worries. We've got another one, do we, Washington?
Yes. Miguel, are you able to ask the question directly? Are you there with us?
Can you hear me without much background noise?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Wait, I'm curious how public figures who are known to use big words, how do they get away with it? Say, like, Boris Johnson had one example. He's known to use some very over-erudite, over-the-top vocab, but people still have this strong retention of what he says.
Yeah, well, look, I'll be honest. A lot of the Boris Johnson things that I remember are when he's used simpler language. Do you have some examples, Miguel, of some of the more complex words and terms that he's used?
Oh, one of something that's become very popular is when he used that phrase, I think something like great supine protoplasmic invertebrate jellies or something like that, which became something of a meme when he was actually addressing the parliament at one point, as opposed to just saying something very sharp and short.
Yeah, sure. And so, look, you know, Boris Johnson's background, I mean, I believe he was like a champion debater at, was it Oxford or Cambridge? I can't remember what university he was at, but he's certainly a very educated person, right? Look, Boris Johnson, look, so if you are an exceptionally charismatic presenter, then that can often hold people. I would also say if he's talking in Parliament, that is different to doing a media interview, for example, with the BBC or one of those type of outlets. I would suggest he might not use that kind of language in those kind of media interviews. But look, and look, as you said, when he used that term, that became a meme. And because it was so complex, it wasn't that people necessarily understood what he said. It was just amusing that he used it, and that became a meme. So I suppose that's one way of doing it. But you know, also what I would say, there's a difference between using educated language and formal or overly clinical language, right? So if you use a lot of business buzzwords, for example, if you say, oh, look, yeah, so look, of course, our company, our shareholders are our number one priority. And, we're really keen to focus on the synergies between the two businesses. And, hopefully, when we line all of our ducks up in a row, we're going to, so you could recite a whole lot of these kind of cliches and some of these other business terms, and it'll just go straight over people's heads because they've heard them 100 times before, or they don't know what you're talking about, right? Now that's different to using perhaps if you have a flair with words, right? If you're able to use colorful words are different to formal words. In fact, they're quite the opposite. One's boring, one's interesting, right? So yeah, but look, I guess, without knowing too many of the examples you've got in mind, I hope that's gone some way to answering the question.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Ky.
Okay, great. Okay, well, look, let's move on, and we'll take some more questions later. So send them through, and Washington will pick the winners to ask them. Okay, so I've talked about key messages. So as we've mentioned before, they should be short, sharp. They're going to help you remember. They're going to help your audience remember. Always have them ready going into an interview. Do not just write down a list of potential questions and rehearse answers to them. I promise you that will lead you to grief, right? Because you're going to forget a lot of it when you head into the interview. Like even if you were to have it right in front of you, I promise you'll forget a lot of it. Okay, so key messages. Now, of course, you're not just going to say your key message, but I want to give you one example. Let's say one of the key messages that Jeff had heading into the interview, let's say one of his key messages was, Professional Development Forum in Sydney is a place where people from Asian backgrounds can develop their professional skills and thus elevate themselves in the workplace. Let's say that's a long way. So let me try to put that in a shorter key message type of way. Professional Development Forum helps people from an Asian background succeed in the Australian workplace. That's it, right? Let's just say that's the key message. So you are going to say that key message, but of course, you can't just say a key message, of course. You need to back it up, and you back it up or you detail it with what we call message supports, okay? So what's a message support? It's when you explain or you give evidence for your key message, right? So you can't just say professional development helps people from an Asian background succeed in the professional workplace. You're going to say why, of course, right? So try these. First of all, stories, okay? So these are the different types of supports you may not have thought about or noticed, but that skilled media spokespeople use. Stories, statistics or stats, and sound bites, okay? Stories, stats, and sound bites are fundamental supports that people use for their key messages. So let me go through each of them and what they mean. First of all, I actually wanted to start with stats. I'm going to go out of turn there because of facts. This is what most people think they need to do when they give a key message. Why is Professional Development Forum, a way that Asian Australians can improve their professional prospects? Oh, well, because we bring together people from diverse backgrounds and we give them exposure to great speakers who come from a range of backgrounds, and they are able to pass on great skills to these people. Next question, right? So that's how many people would. They would just straight out explain the key message, right? Or they would give facts, right? And they can be useful. If you are going to use stats and facts, make sure they're clear and simple. And if they're not, make sure you at least explain it. So, for example, let's say one of the statistics you used is, say perhaps the one that Jeff used. For example, that, when people from an Asian background submit their CVs, they are basically, from what I could roughly tell, they are maybe, about 30% less likely to get a call back compared to if they put a Western or an Anglo name on the CV. I know that, Jeff, that's not the actual statistic, but I'm just giving as an example. Now, that's a fairly straightforward statistic, and I think that one's okay to use. Okay, but many people just think, oh, I'm just going to go straight to the facts or the statistic, right? So I want to, but never have more than one or two. Instead, I would strongly encourage you to all, if you ever do media interviews, to support your key messages with stories. Now, I want you to have a look at the photos that you can see on your screen there. All of those people should be very famous. Do all of you recognize who they are? Can I get a few nods here and there? Yeah, so at the top right, George Floyd, who is the, obviously the Black American who was, tragically killed by police, and obviously has triggered a colossal response in many different ways, right? So not only have there been protests and riots, but there's been pushback against those protests and riots, massive political upheaval. Susan Boyle, does anyone remember her from, I think it was it Britain's Got Talent or The Voice? I can't remember which of those British shows, but that just goes to show, right? What was much more important was she had an amazing story, right? She's just this, obscure, not particularly glamorously presented, lady from, suburban England. And then she became a megastar, right? And then, of course, we have Harvey Weinstein, right? Now, all of those people, what they have in common are stories that led to a greater message. So in the case of George Floyd, his was a story so that, for example, when many people argue that people from an Afro-American background are discriminated against by police, for example, or institutions in America, they cite his example. Now, I know that that's a controversial opinion according to many people. They'll say, well, hang on a second. Like, there's far more black people killed, you know, in the streets of Chicago every week in gang violence. And you're just picking on like one guy or a handful of other people, such as Breonna Taylor and so forth. That's not that's not statistically strong enough. Well, even whether or not you agree that his case is typical or not, the vast majority of the world knows who he is, knows what his story was, and why that movement exists. Similarly, with Harvey Weinstein, he has become the story when it comes to Me Too or sexual harassment. If you ask anyone who's the foremost figure when it comes to that, he's highly likely to be the first name they come up with, right? And that's because of the stories involving Harvey Weinstein. See, you can make an argument about how men sexually harass women in the workplace. You can describe the kind of things that happen, how it makes women feel in that somewhat academic way. But when you tell a story, people are much more likely to remember it. They make your key message real. Okay, statistics can sort of sound powerful, but a story makes it real. They are also easily remembered. People don't forget these stories. And again, whether or not you think that these stories justify the outcome that they achieved, regardless of what you think of the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, or quite frankly, Susan Boyle singing, right? You will remember their stories. Okay? People are memorable and stories are about people. They will give you energy and empathy. So some of you might think, oh, look, I could do media interviews, but I don't really have a good voice. Look, I'm not really dynamic. I'm a sort of a quieter kind of person. I don't have that kind of up and down voice that Ky has, for example, that sometimes people say I'm a bit too animated. But when you tell a story, I promise you, your voice will automatically lift when you tell that story. And I bet that when you talk to your friends and family and you tell them about an actual story, something that happened that day, your voice will be much more energetic than if you were just simply explaining a concept to them. Okay? So that's why stories are a very underrated message support to use in media training. And quite frankly, any training. If you ever do a presentation at work, I would encourage you to use stories, especially if you don't have statistics, because stories are powerful. Okay? Then there's the other, sound bites. Okay? Now, again, here's some pretty controversial, memorable quotes. In history, for example, Martin Luther King. Then there are just the ones that we've all heard a million times. The pen is mightier than the sword. Anyone ever remember who said that? Nope. It was a guy called Edward Bulwer Lytton. Most of us have never heard of him, but we remember his message. We remember that quote, right? So basically, it's your key message, but with flair, right? So say, make America great again, right? Now, again, regardless of whether you think that that movement has been destructive and divisive, or whether you think it's been, a good thing for America and restore pride in America, everyone knows what it's. Everyone knows it. Everyone has heard it, right? And that's because words with flair, right, have a way of being remembered. So going to Miguel's question, for example, where he said, "Oh, well, look, he." Use this big, long, complex, fancy term. Well, it was memorable. It had flair, right? And of course, Me Too, such a simple quote, right? Just a simple phrase. But that's all it needed to be, right? Because it told so much behind it, right? So sound bites and quotes, by the way, if you are going to do them, first of all, they're hard for journalists to miss. I can tell you as a journalist, if we hear things like this, we hear quotes like this, they are gold, right? Because our craft requires us to be able to present. It requires us to be able to bring in an audience, right? And quotes are something that audiences like, right? And when you're a tired journalist going through 30 minutes of a transcript or a recording, I promise you a catchy phrase is going to be very easy for a journalist to cut out and put in their story, okay? Now, prepare them in advance. That's what I would say. It is not easy, right? That I have a dream speech, I'm pretty sure Martin Luther King didn't write it 10 minutes before he went onto the podium, right? And even something like Me Too, even, right? I mean, that became extremely popular and high profile very, very quickly, right? But could you have come up with something like that and seen it take off? Maybe not, right? And same with Make America Great Again. I mean, I'm pretty sure Donald Trump didn't just come up with it in 2 minutes. That probably would have been very carefully considered. So again, prepare in advance for these kind of quotes. And if you don't have it, well, there's communications professionals, writers who can help you with that. But again, sound bites, not always that easy to come up with one that everyone's going to remember. Stories, I am pretty sure that every single one of the 40 or so people watching this webinar could come up with a story about a key message they want to get out to the Australian public. So, interview technique. It's as simple as ABC. Not the place that I used to work for, but let me explain what it is. It's about remembering why you're there. So remember what I said before. You are not just there to answer journalist questions, right? You are there because you have something important to talk about. So you need to remember that once the interview starts. So there's two types of questions, open-ended questions and close-ended questions that people get asked, right? An open-ended question is one that leaves open what your answer might be. It could be something like, oh, so Jeff, tell us about what you think about Asian leadership. And some of you may remember, I asked Jeff an open-ended question at the start of the interview. The open-ended question is an easy question, or it looks like an easy question. It's a free kick, but it has higher waffle risk. So what do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, because it's so open-ended, you might just start talking and not stop, right? And then you might just start wandering off on talking about, giving a long answer that, remember, no one is going to remember, okay? So open-ended questions, though, are often how a journalist starts an interview to put you at ease, to make you comfortable, right? They often know that you haven't done media before and they don't want a car crash interview right from the get-go. Even if they've got some tough questions coming up, they will often ask you an open-ended one just so you can get out what you're there to talk about, okay? Now, how do you stop yourself from waffling off during an open-ended question? I should add that this is something that you can apply in job interview questions as well. If you are brought before someone, how many of you have been in a job interview where you started talking and because you were maybe a little bit nervous, you just kept talking. And then you suddenly realize in the back of your mind that you'd been talking too much and you just suddenly stopped. And then you could tell the interviewer was thinking, yeah, guess I don't have much time to ask my other questions, right? So I'm trying to give you a formula now that to help you keep your answers short. Because remember, the shorter they are, the simpler they are, the more likely it is they're going to be remembered. So start with your key message for impact. So one of the mistakes many people make is they think, oh no, I'm going to give background information first, right? So let's say I asked Jeff, so Jeff, tell me about your, just tell me about what you think about Asian leadership. And then you might say something like, oh, well, look, in Australia for a long time, we've had a lot of, there's been a lot of companies that have had a lot of Caucasian leaders, and that's been somewhat a product of history. And they've achieved some great results over time. But then, of course, Australia's demographic has changed. We've had more migrants, and so it's not really quite the same. So you're waffling. You're giving background information, whereas it would be far more important to start off perhaps with a key message. So let's say it's like, oh, tell me about what you say. Tell me about tell me about, why you think Asian leaders struggle or why Asians have struggled to reach senior leadership positions, for example. Start with your key message. So what's your key message? Let's say it was a plug for PDF. You could say something like, you could work it in there, right? You could say, because it's an open-ended question, you could say, I think what we need in Australia are more ways to develop young Asian professionals, such as, for example, Professional Development Forum, where we give people practical skills that help them achieve their workplace objectives, right? And then you might say, and so, yeah, and the reason I mention that practical aspect is because we often hear so much talk about these things. You know, we hear about the backgrounds of the people who have been there for such a long time before. So you can then go into the detail. So you're not leaving out detail and you are not leaving out background. You're just not saying it first, right? You are starting with your key message because that's going to have impact, okay? So you start with your key message and then you support it, as I mentioned, with a story, a stat, or a soundbite. So for example, you might say, look, professional development, what we need in Australia are more ways for young Asian professionals to develop their professional skills so they can do better in the Australian workplace, including places like Professional Development Forum. So for example, we had, Ky Chow, and she was an amazing young woman who had a lunch with 100 strangers. And she did that as a way of developing her ability to deal with different people. And she learned so much about them after being in a largely insular Hong Kong-based business community for many, many years. And she learned so much from that experience. She can now talk to anyone, Ky. She can talk to anyone now. Right? So that's your story, okay? And then summarize it. Tell your story or give your statistic or your soundbite and then summarize by just repeating your key message again. Because otherwise you won't know where to stop. So you might say something like, so Kelly really had such an incredible, innovative approach. And that's the kind of stuff that we have at Professional Development Forum. Those kind of speakers that give real practical advice to young Asian professionals, okay? So you've got your start, your support, and then you've summarized it. You've said your key message at the start and the finish of your answer. So twice, you've got the repetition, more likely to be remembered. So that's one way of approaching open-ended questions. Now, next, close-ended questions. So these are the tougher ones, right? And this is where I'm going to teach you a concept called bridging. It's as easy as ABC. So first of all, what's a close-ended question? It's very simple. Jeff, do you think that we need to have targets and quotas to increase the amount of Asian representation in leadership? Yes or no? It's a yes or no question, right? Or it is something where you demand a particular answer, right? And the journalist might have other ways. Look, isn't it true that they might say to a politician, isn't it true that you cut a deal with this particular party and then they went back on their word? Isn't that true? It's a yes or no question, right? Much tougher question because you can't then just start talking about whatever you want to. You need to find a way of getting to what you want to talk about, okay? So, first of all, you must acknowledge or answer their question, right? Now, yes, I told you before that you are not doing a media interview just to answer the journalist's questions. So try not to answer it for long. And quite frankly, if it's not on a topic you want to talk about, you don't need to answer the question at all. You need to acknowledge the question though, right? So I'm going to give you an example. Someone says to you, let's say you're doing a media interview with the Financial Review and they say, oh, so look, we've got a lot of, I'd be interested to know with your marketing agency, what kind of questions you get? Do you do a lot of work with social media? Now, let's say that your company doesn't do squat with social media, doesn't do anything with social media, right? Now you might think, social media is really important, Ky. Facebook, Twitter, it's all important. I think we all, you'll be stuck, if you try to answer their question anyway. But you can acknowledge it. You can say something like, look, Ky, of course, social media is very important. We understand why a lot of people are interested. But what we think is actually more important is a focus on sales execution, right? Being able to actually deliver on that. And we think that's actually the most important thing, right? So you acknowledge, and then what I did just then was I used a bridge. That bridge was the phrase, so I think what's more important here though is, right? So I'm not sure if all of you caught that, but that was how I got from the question about social media, which I didn't want to answer, to the answer I did want to talk about, right? My key message. So acknowledge, bridge, and then communicate to a key message. Communicate one of your key messages. So some of the bridges, phrases like a phrase I just used. Look, I think the important thing to remember here is, so you say that to get you from the journalist's question to what you want to talk about, okay? If there's just one thing, look, if there's one thing I think that's really important, it's this. That's what's called a flagging phrase, right? Because you're basically saying, before you give your statement, you're actually saying, this is important, I want you to listen, right? If there's one thing I can say about this, what's more important is, and you may have even heard, look, at the end of the day, I think this, right? Those kind of phrases are what help people get from what the journalist wants to talk about to what you want to talk about, okay? I would encourage you, again, to do this. Let's say you're at an investor meeting, right? And you get asked questions by an analyst, for example, or an investor about the company you work for. Now, a lot of the times I've had people come out of those, like some of my clients come out of those and say, oh my gosh, Ky, I just spent the whole time on the back foot answering all of their questions. Even in an investor meeting, you should, sure, answer the questions they have, but never pass the opportunity to then talk about your key message. So they might ask you about, look, can you just tell us about what your, tell us about this PE ratio. I don't understand why you've been able to stay afloat, even though it's like this. Answer their question, but then say, look, so we've been able to achieve that PE ratio because of this, that, and the other. But I think what's more important is we've got a really strong pipeline in the works. Our future is absolutely locked in. Now, that's not what they asked you about, but they're going to remember it, especially if you can say it more than once. And you've answered their question, so they're not going to complain, right? So we won't have time to watch the video interview, but I basically just told you this gentleman in particular got asked about marketing, and he got a question about social media that he clearly was not ready for, but he was able to answer it by bridging to one of his key messages instead. Okay, now tough or unexpected questions, right? So this is where you can really get a curly one. Hopefully, when you first start doing media, you won't be getting these kind of questions, but it's good to be ready for them anyway. What if you get a question that you just don't know the answer to? Do you say no comment? Do you say, I don't know? Right? So here's a few. Don't speculate. So if someone says, look, let's say that this competitor was to come to Australia, wouldn't they just wipe you out? Right? Like if someone asks a question like that, don't go, oh, well, yeah, I suppose if, I suppose if Alibaba did open a place here, then that would be pretty hard for us to do. Don't speculate, all right? It's juicy stuff for a journalist, but you should not be drawn into it because you're just making things up at that point, right? Don't say no comment, right? It looks terrible. I'm sure we've all seen people doing it on TV. It just looks like you're trying to evade the question, right? Okay, fine, Ky. So what do I do when I get asked a question I don't know the answer to? So there can be a few different ways you can handle it. Offer to provide the info later, right? So you might say, let's say you like, I'll give you an example, right? I might get asked, oh, look, Ky, what was the CEO's comment? So let's say I was a business reporter commenting on a press conference I'd attended with the AMP CEO, right? And let's say my anchor threw me a question saying, oh, so Ky, and what about that incident with the AMP Capital CEO? Did they talk much about that? Now, let's say that I had I don't know, maybe I'd come in late, or maybe I'd missed that answer somehow, right? I could say something like, yeah, look, it's obviously been an issue that many people have been keen to talk about. The exact details of that, though, I'm still going through. More than happy to talk about it in the next bulletin. What I think is important, though, is the focus on what they're going to do to restore their reputation. So I've offered to provide the information later, and then I've bridged to one of the things that I wanted to talk about. So I don't just kind of stand there going, can I just give you that later? And then end of answer. I've used it to give some information, which is useful, okay? So as I mentioned, I bridged, and then also think before you speak, okay? So if you get thrown, don't try to answer things on the fly. So look, I did say, I know we're running towards the end of our time, but I am going to try to play you this clip from the BP CEO, which was a question that he received, and hopefully the audio will work. Come on, NBN. Here we go.
Sunday, BP's CEO apologized.
Whoop.
I'm sorry. We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused to their lives. And, you know, there's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. You know, I'd like my life back.
Life here may never be.
Okay, so does anyone remember that incident? Yeah, so the BP CEO, after the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, said that. He obviously just thought on the fly, I want it to be over. I just want my life back. You know, this is after an oil spill that has caused a catastrophic environmental disaster, and has massive impact on people's lives. And here you are with an extremely rich, now, by the way, he is no longer the CEO of BP, right? So always think before you speak. Do not feel pressured ever to blurt something out, okay? And that takes discipline. So what happens if it all goes wrong, right? I've given you a whole bunch of techniques here. Anyone ever who's seen this quote from Mike Tyson? Everyone's got a plan till they get punched in the mouth, right? All kinds of stuff can happen during an interview, folks. You can forget things. As I mentioned, the lights go on. You forget half of your key messages about 1 minute into the interview, right? Finish strong. If an interview has gone bad, if you're already thinking, oh my goodness, I never want to do a media interview for the rest of my life, remember you can finish strong and salvage an interview. Flag your final message. So often the presenter will give you a clue. They'll say, look, Ky, just finally before we wrap up here, can you tell us this? That's an opportunity for you to finish on a strong key message. And you can say something like, look, ultimately, I think the most important thing here, Lee, is this, right? Right? So even when an interview doesn't go well, including a job interview, right? Not just a media interview, when you know it's coming to an end, try to finish strong. People remember that. So look, guys, that's pretty much the end of it. I'll just very quickly run through the differences between print interviews. So print interviews or written interviews, they can be in much more depth, right? So I'm going to whip through this on quite quickly because I know we're a little over time. They can be much more in depth, right? Sometimes they're a lunch, you know, at the AFR, we actually had a segment called Lunch with the AFR, right? Where people would just go and have a decadent lunch somewhere. And as you can imagine, journalists love it because people tend to have a few wines. They hopefully say something they're not supposed to, right? It's fantastic, right? So that's the danger of pin reviews. The relaxed format can mean that you just waffle on and forget your key message, or you might only say it once, right? So, you know, just covering Robert's question earlier. So still try to keep your answers short, even though it is a longer interview, okay? Now, then we get to broadcast interviews, TV and radio. Body language, posture, and eye contact are important. Don't have enormous time to go into a lot of the specifics of that, other than to say, quite frankly, a lot of it's overrated, right? You know, I've heard people say, oh, try to hold, you know, use the power triangle, hold your fingers in this position so you can move them apart quickly and so forth. Look, you can use those if you want, but quite frankly, I prefer not to make people think too much about their posture. I prefer much more to think about your messages and be convinced of them. Because if you're convinced about your key messages, it'll come through in your body language. The support, so stories tend to work very well when it comes to television. Silence is golden as well, right? So a common journalist technique is to ask you a question and then just be quiet, right? You answer the question and then they'll just stop. They won't give you another question. And why do they do that? Because they're waiting for you to keep talking, right? Because they know you've gotten out your magic answer, your key message. Now they're just waiting to see what else you might come up with. Let's just have a little bit of awkward silence to see what you might say, okay? And another famous one, treat every microphone as though it was live. When the journalist, unless you actually say to a journalist, have you stopped recording or can we speak off the record now? Everything is on the record. Anything you say, the journalist is allowed to use. It doesn't matter whether they say, oh, thanks for your time, Jeff, and then you're walking out the door with them and then you blurt something out to them, right? They can use it. They're 100% allowed to use it, unless you have actually said first, so this is off the record. Now, if you say that, the journalist must honor it, okay? So guys, look, that's a very quick overview. I sometimes give people this sheet, interview preparation, write down your key message, jot down some supports, right? Sometimes that should be the only thing in front of you, not a list of 20 potential questions and your answers to them, okay? So that wraps things up, guys. Washington, you want to throw us some of the questions we've gotten so far?
I'm just gonna do something a bit unusual. Just gonna go a bit off the script over here. So I'm just gonna conclude our official time. And if you have time, can we do the questions as overtime, please? There's some interesting questions up there. So
absolutely. So if anyone needs to leave, I completely understand, and I apologize that we run a little over time.
Yeah, and you guys, just before you go, could you just complete our poll? We have like our internal poll. If you could do that for us, it'd be great. Frankie, you're going to be releasing that, right? Thank you, Frankie. And just to officially like conclude the session, it's really good to have Ky and gives all those practical, instructions and things that we can prepare ourselves better to face that really tough moments. Like, facing a report is, I'm sure, is not an easy thing. And then I just would like to thank you all our team that helps, put this whole thing together behind the scenes. Thank you so much for all your help. And then just to remind you guys that our next event is to be Thursday, 8th of October, 6 p.m. And we'll be have Rocky Scopelli, renowned futurologist, who will share his unique insights on how to best prepare yourself for a world that keeps changing. The link will be on the chat box in there very soon. And so that's we officially conclude our session for tonight. But now we can proceed to our, the fun time, some questions. All right, Ky, thanks so much for, stick around with us.
Yeah, any questions, just chuck them in the chat, folks.
So, and then I think, okay, so Frankie had a question. Hey, Frankie, would you like to ask the question, please?
Okay, sure. Hi, Ky. For people that are not used to in the public, how to calm your nerve before an interview or presentations?
Look, everyone has a different approach. So, in terms of preparing for something that they are nervous about, I can tell you what I did, because the first time I went on air, on camera, I can tell you, I must have sweated like a liter of sweat, right? So my way, look, again, following my general philosophy of keeping things simple, is just to take slow, deep breaths, right? It sounds simple, but if you don't have time to do meditation or whatever beforehand, then just do that just before. Sometimes even while the question is being asked, I will just breathe in and out slowly, and that tends. I think it's when you breathe long and slowly, take deep breaths, hold and release, it really will quell nerves, I found, very quickly. And as I said, just squeeze them in when the question is being asked, if that helps.
Thank you, Ky. That's very helpful.
No worries.
Christine Nichols has another question as well. Would you like to ask the question, Chris?
Oh, hi, Ky. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk today. How do you stop yourself from saying or so when you're being interviewed or in a presentation? I find those are the two words that I just say a million times.
You're not the only one, Christine. Everyone does it, partly because, and then it becomes a vicious cycle because we all hear people using so in between, right? And I think as many of you know, grammatically, so doesn't mean anything. People are just using it as a filler, like right? Except they decided that saying so sounded better than saying Both do become a little bit annoying. Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, if you just say it from time to time, it's not really a big deal. It's just part of natural speech. If you know you say them repeatedly to the point that it becomes annoying, then that does become an issue because then people are going to be less receptive to what you've got to say. They will, unfortunately, be judgmental enough to say, oh, look, that person just is umming the whole way through. So how do you get around it? So I can tell you, I do both of those things. I have done, especially the thing. What was another one of my common ones? I would say, you know, right? I would say that a lot. And even okay. Look, in terms of getting around it, it just takes practice and consciously thinking about it. So what I mean by that is you should try to practice giving answers without those things. So when you catch yourself doing it, right? If I say, for example, so Professional Development Forum is a great way for people from an Asian background to increase their, their professional prospects, right? If I catch myself doing it, I'll just say the same thing again, but this time just discipline myself in not saying it until I get it right. And the more you practice it, the better you'll get at it. One thing I definitely can recommend is take a breath before you answer. See, if you take a moment before you start speaking, you're less likely to kind of think on the fly and then throw in things like ums and so's, right? Just take a moment. When you're interviewed, having a 1 or 2 second pause, it may seem very long to you, but it is not that long. And if it helps you gather your thoughts and give a slower, more careful and considered answer, then it's a better result for everyone.
Thank you so much.
Lily Chow, would you like to ask the question?
Hello, thanks for this good presentation. I'm just wondering, what if the journalist is biased and you feel that the journalist is keeping leading you with weird questions?
Yeah. So, Lily, remember what I said before. Your focus should not be on the journalist. In a way, it doesn't matter how biased they are. And this is now, to be clear, I completely understand the concern because many people feel, especially if the journalist is being quite aggressive, for example, with their opinion, they feel they have to address it. They have to prove the journalist wrong. But you're not there to convince the journalist. The journalist is just one person. You have an audience watching your conversation, and that is where your focus should be. So I would not listen, I would not have the journalist bias front of mind, even if they are that way, right? You should still focus on what your key message is. So let's say the journalist asks you something incredibly one-sided, right? I mean, I'm not sure, Lily, if you had a particular question that you've seen being asked before that showed a journalist bias that I could use as an example. Oh, I think Lily's vanished. Okay, but the short of it is it shouldn't matter what the journalist's opinions are. You let them talk about what they want to talk about. Your job is to talk to the audience out there that is receptive to you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have this kind of example before, but I saw some interview on TV. Because the journalist he likes to leading the interviewee to a direction, but interviewee insists on his own point. Then the whole interview looks like very embarrassing.
Well, that's the journalist's problem then. See, the right audience will see that the journalist is biased. They will see that the journalist is not letting the other person answer fairly. It's important not to lose your temper and start to criticize or attack the journalist. Often there's a reason that why people are watching that show. It's because they like that journalist. So you just focus on your key message and your audience as much as you can. So again, try to visualize someone when you answer the question. Try to imagine there's people watching who you do want to convince, and envisage their face instead of the journalist, for example.
Thank you.
Awesome. Do you mind if I ask the last question?
Sure.
Cool. Humor, like playing a joke or make something that a bit funny, just to soften the moments. What's your perspective about that?
Using humor. Okay, so it's often said about interviews that it's not just what you say, but it's how you come across. So even, for example, if you don't get your key message across, if people see you as someone who's likable and fun, then they are likely to maybe look you up later on. So there's certainly value. There's certainly some truth to that. Look, if you can do humor, it's fine. Obviously, you need to pick your occasion, right? If you're being interviewed about a bad news topic, that's not the time to bring up humor. But say during one of your stories, right? So for example, you might talk about your experience as an Asian person, and you might say, oh, look, when we, let's say, the point you want to make is about the challenges that Asian people have in talking about pop culture in an Australian workplace, for example, right? That's just off the top of my head. And you might say, oh, so for example, often my colleagues talk about the rugby and MasterChef, and I don't watch either of those programs. And that's it. That's the end of your answer. Well, that does come across as a little bit dull and a bit whingy. But if you can be funny about it, then it can make sometimes a difficult opinion a little more palatable. So you might be something like, oh, they're talking about MasterChef, and I was thinking, I should know about this topic. Asians, I spend so much time eating, maybe I should start watching this program, right? So even just a little joke like that can help settle and put people at ease. And I think it still has value within the answer.
Okay, that's pretty good, man. Thanks for that. And I'm gonna play a joke on you, I like you. There's one more question. I think it's a really good question. So just the last question. Teresa, would you like to ask Ky the question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Ky. Thank you for your presentation. It's been very insightful. I just have one or two questions. You mentioned that sometimes you go into an interview and then you straight away forget your key messages. Do you have any advice in terms of how to gather your thoughts and remember them? Like, is there a certain way that you prepare your key messages before the interview to help you remember?
Yeah. So what I do, Teresa, so you know how I mentioned before how just because writing down a list of potential questions and then your perfect answer to them is not a smart thing to do, right? Now and I said that isn't the only thing you should do, but it can be a useful way of starting your process of preparing for an interview. So I'll give you an example, right? Like I do a panel called the Journos panel on Richard Glover's program on ABC, and they actually will give us the questions, right? They'll give us like 3 questions. Now, they don't always stick to those questions, right? But they usually will start off with something. So it gives you something to prepare with. And what I do, I actually will start typing notes. Like I'll just start just the brain dump about what I think. I'll do some research and I'll just write down that answer. And of course, it'll be like 6 paragraphs long or something like that, right? But then what I'll do is then I will start chopping that down. And then often I'll reach roughly what looks like what might be an ideal answer, word for word, right? But that is not what I then take with me into the interview, because I'm not going to read off a piece of paper. Even without a camera, people can tell that you're doing that, and it's absolutely terrible audio. You generally won't be asked again. And journalists can tell, we can tell within half a second if you're reading off a piece of paper. So what I do instead is, so I've written down that answer, I'll chop it down again to maybe 2 or 3 dot points, right? So just 3 dot points about what the answer is, right? Now I can tell you, you're not going to remember dot points in an interview, but you're doing that process where you're going through the answer in your head, but now you're learning to distill it. After I've written those 3 dot points, I am going to write down 3 words just to jog my memory. That it's just, so for example, let's say my point might be, I don't know, let's say, for example, using the example that we had with Jeff earlier on about PDF and how it helps Asian people develop their practical skills, I will just write down the word practical. That's it. Because and then I will have that on a piece of paper during the interview, and then I can just glance down for half a second, and just see the word practical. And then that will hopefully jog my memory as to what I wanted to talk about. Because if you have gone through it, if you're prepared enough for it, that's all you need to remember, hopefully, what your answer should be. So that, you know, when disaster before, so that's something I learned a long time ago. Dot points are still too long, okay? Just put down trigger words that will jog your memory. And so even if I'm on camera, for example, I might have a piece of paper down in front of me and it'll just have those words in a really big font. The camera's not going to see it, but I'll just have it in a big font there, right? And if you're on radio or doing a phone interview, even better, right? You then you, although I still wouldn't recommend relying on dot points, because remember, the more time you spend reading, the less time you spend listening to the host, and that can be quite disastrous as well too, if you forget the question.
Absolutely, thank you for that. I do find that sometimes when you have a script and you lose your train of thought, it just turns out so bad. So yeah, having words, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the same, by the way, it's not unlike the techniques I think some of us used to use when we were cramming for exams. You know?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ky. Thank you so much for your time and kindness to tell us the practicalities of have a good interview. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much, Washington. And again, like if people are interested in media training or just learning more about the media, just go to my website, kychow.com. I'm happy to be contacted there and happy to be contacted on social media if you've got any questions. I'd love to help more people out with this kind of thing, because doing media appearances is something that I think everyone should have up their repertoire, and it's something you can apply in many situations besides media.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you.